my way into this is as a Christian theologian, and I guess I want to start by saying that as a Christian, I have to be aware of a certain tension, that is that within our culture, the image of Jesus, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, has become very much a meme within our culture, especially around Christmas time. And we forget that Jesus was, in his time, a radical, or at least could have been described in those terms. We know that the Romans didn't crucify moderates. So to get yourself crucified in the ancient Roman Empire, you would have to be perceived as a threat to the state. And the only people who were crucified were, on the one hand, revolutionaries or insurrectionists, or escaped slaves. And both of them challenged in their own way the Pax Romana, the social order. So both were considered to be undesirables, and if they had the term, radicals. So that's kind of what really struck me when Scott was talking about putting this together. A panel discussion on radicalization. I mean, I was hearing it in the media, especially after the Paris attacks. I think it was over doing dishes at St. Faith's. I thought to myself, well, I don't want the term radicalization to be co-opted by the media itself. I mean, I want to say that it's okay to be a radical if you're a follower of Jesus, or if you're deeply immersed in another religious tradition. So that was my interest, and then Scott said, well, you should come and talk about this. So that's how I
careful what you say.
Got here. Be careful what you say, especially to Scott. My own interest is really in something that's been called the myth of religious violence, and I come at this largely because of my interest in the way that Christianity functioned in South Africa, both as a way of means of resisting injustice, but also as a kind of part of the superstructure, the foundation of justice, of injustice in South Africa. So I've been very interested for the last 20 or 25 years in looking at the dynamics, especially of Christianity, but also of other religious traditions within South Africa. So coming back to Canada, I've continued to follow this, and it's, again, it's all very much in the news. We often hear in the news a distinction between religious radicals and moderates, and the idea, the subtext is that the moderates are good, they're okay. So if you're a moderate Muslim, you're okay. You can be a moderate Muslim. If you're a moderate Christian, that's okay. You can be a moderate Christian. But if you're a radical, that's not desirable. And I think that this distinction that we see in the media reflects not only a certain blindness about the nature of the secular and the religious foundations of the secular, but this very myth of redemptive violence. The myth of redemptive violence is the assumption that religion is inherently dangerous when unchecked. Specifically, that religion is absolutist, divisive, and irrational. This is the analysis of William T. Kavanaugh that I'm going to be using, but I've noticed that Karen Armstrong has now put out a book called Fields of Blood, in which she takes pretty well the same argument that Kavanaugh puts forward. Let me unpack this myth of religious violence very briefly. The myth arises with the invention of religion as a distinct human activity apart from politics, economics, education, the arts, and so forth. This is very much a move of the modern world. In the ancient world, religion, which comes from the Latin religio, which simply means to bind, would refer to some kind of obligation, and it could be an obligation to one's God, or it could be an obligation to one's neighbor. It was something that bound someone. If we move to the Middle Ages, religion or religious was a designation of a certain kind of clergy. There were some clergy that were called religious and some clergy which were called secular, depending on whether they lived in cloisters. So there, the term religious didn't make a distinction between those who believed in God and those who didn't believe in God, but rather between sort of two orders within the clergy. In early modernity, religion became what was left over after the rise of the state. So beliefs and practices that came to be defined as private as opposed to public. The secular now applied to the nation state. And the nation state held a monopoly on legitimate violence, particularly in defending private property. So the myth of religious violence was created as a kind of creation story of the modern state. Once upon a time, the story goes, humankind was torn apart by contests over obscure god images and assorted minutiae. Since there was no rational way to resolve the conflict, the world, that is to say Europe, was on the verge of destruction. Then stepped in the state as a savior. And how did the state save the situation? It divested religion of its social and cultural power. So religion is tolerated because, people are going to believe stuff, but it has to be policed because religion always remains on the verge of disrupting the peace of the secular. So that, in a nutshell, is the myth of religious violence. It is essentially the legitimating myth of the modern nation state, at least as far as Kavanaugh argues it. How does the myth function? Well, the primary function of the myth is to rein in a multiplicity of loyalties that transcend the borders of the nation state, and to make one loyalty determinative. Thus, I am, before anything else, a Canadian. We even have this in the names of some of the Christian churches. So the Anglican Church of Canada, the United Church of Canada, the Presbyterian Church of Canada. And what's really important there is the of Canada. The idea is that Canada is the numerator and Presbyterian Church is the denominator. Okay. So the biggest loyalty that we have, the most fundamental loyalty that we have, is our loyalty to the nation state. And that identity determines and ranks and orders all of the other obligations that I have. So religious loyalty is okay in its place, but it becomes a threat when it points to what we might call a transnational community beyond the control of the state, which is, as Kavanaugh argues this with regards to why the Roman Catholic Church was considered to be such a threat in early modern Britain. It's not that people were threatened by beliefs, by the invocation of the saints, by rosaries, all that kind of stuff. It's because Roman Catholics' loyalty was outside the control of the nation state. There was a notion of a Catholica, a church, that could not be reined in or made subject to the state. So that was considered to be a threat. And I think that's also one of the reasons why Islam is considered to be such a threat to the modern nation state, because Islam talks about a loyalty that cannot be reined in, it cannot be brought under the control of the nation. So it's a transnational community beyond the control of the state. Another function of the myth of religious violence is to legitimize what we might call secular violence against religion. So the reasoning goes, you can't reason with religious radicals. You can't reason with them because they're not rational. So the only recourse is to bomb them, quote, back into the Stone Age. So this is very much the discourse of the new atheists. So we think about people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. Harris, for example, condemns, and these are Kavanaugh's words, the irrational religious torture of witches, but provides his own argument for torturing terrorists. These are Harris's own words. In such a situation, Harris writes, where we have terrorists operating, the only thing likely to ensure our survival, and the our survival means the survival of Western secular people, may be a nuclear first strike of our own. This is from his book, The End of Faith. Needless to say, this would be an unthinkable crime, as it would kill tens of millions of innocent civilians in a single day. but it may be the only course of action available to us given what Islamists believe, end quote. Harris thinks this is a, and again quoting, a plausible scenario in which much of the world's population could be annihilated on account of religious ideas that belong on the same shelf with Batman, the Philosopher's Stone, and unicorns, okay, end quote. So you hear what they're saying, right? I mean, he's talking about a first strike, but it's their fault because of the beliefs that they hold, which cannot be brought under the control of reason. So,
don't you just like those unicorns sometimes?
Oh yeah. What's wrong with you? Hey, my daughter, by the way, and if anyone knows how to get a hold of a giant unicorn stuffy for my daughter's 8th birthday party next week, we are desperately trying to get a hold of one. So if you could help with that, that would be great. Yeah. She would very much believe in unicorns. So the myth of religious violence functions in this and other kinds of ways that we can talk about as well. There are a number of problems with the myth of religious violence. Firstly, it's historically untrue. The so-called wars of religion can easily be understood to be the wars of early states. And so there are instances, and Kavanaugh chronicles these, and so does Armstrong in her work, of Catholics fighting Catholics, Protestants fighting Protestants, where you realize that they were not simply fighting over transubstantiation or the question of the inclusion of the Apocrypha in the Bible or those kinds of things. What they were fighting over was territory, not simply beliefs. Secondly, the myth of religious violence doesn't work with non-Christian religions like Islam, which don't play nice with the definition, because Islam is not only transnational, but it insists on the submission of one's whole life, not just part of one's life. And I think that, speaking as a Christian, this is something that Christians have to learn from Muslims, because Christians have become so habituated to reining in their convictions so as to fit in with the nation state that they've forgotten that their convictions are supposed to be about all of life, not just about that one piece of life that the state doesn't find threatening. And there are other things you could say about this as well. The invention of religion in the 16th, 17th century, and of course Cantwell Smith's book, The Meaning and End of Religion, talks about this as well, about how this term, once it gets invented, it's essentially supposed to apply to Christianity, but then once Europeans begin to voyage to different parts of the world, how do they identify the people that live in a particular country? They identify them as being religious. So there's all kinds of questions about the invention of Hinduism, the invention of Confucianism. In the late 19th century, there was a debate between Western scholars who insisted that Confucianism was a religion and Chinese scholars who insisted that it wasn't. But of course, the Chinese scholars were wrong. So the second problem. The third problem is it sets up a false either-or. If what is called religion tends to violence because it is absolutist, irrational, and divisive, the secular nation state portrays itself as oriented to peace because, contra religion, it is tolerant, and pluralist, rational, and unitive. Of course, the irony is that almost all of the wars of the 20th century were not between religions, but between nation states. Think about the First World War, where you've got Christians killing Christians because they happen to march under a different flag. In fact, as sociologists like Carolyn Marvin have argued, the objects of devotion, like the flag, sacred texts, national anthems, stories of blood, sacrifice, and martyrs, think about Remembrance Day, holy days, think about Canada Day or the 4th of July in the US, and so forth, make loyalty to the nation state actually look an awful lot like religion. And one of the interesting observations that I heard about the Paris attacks was that for the Enlightenment, if we think about France as being the birthplace of the Enlightenment, and we think about the sacredness of freedom of expression, right? It is a sacred right that someone has to make a cartoon, regardless of whether that is offensive or not. So, and the defense of the right of the cartoonists to make those cartoons is seen as a sacred thing, right? So the whole kind of question about what is sacred and what is not sacred becomes very interesting and negotiable, and so forth. So, I mean, you could say more things about this myth of religious violence. It is prevalent within the media. It's assumed that if you take your religious convictions too seriously, it will invariably and inevitably lead to violence. I think what's incumbent upon people who consider themselves to be Christians and Muslims, particularly, but not just Christians and Muslims, is to demonstrate how living deeply into those convictions can make one a good citizen, but not an uncritical citizen. Living deeply into those convictions means that you do have a loyalty that is more fundamental, that is more deep, that is higher, more profound than the loyalty to the nation state, right? And within the context of that higher, deeper loyalty, you can look at your other duties and obligations, to keep the law, to pay taxes, and so forth, as being relative to that higher, deeper loyalty, which I think is not itself unthreatening to the nation state. So there's more that could be said about this, but I look forward to some conversations with Irfan and Arlette.